somewhere in the last couple of parts of this talk, and certainly in a lot more detail before that elsewhere in other talks and writings and courses, we've explained how a practitioner might sort of cotton on at some point, hear about or realize a little bit, cotton on to this idea of fabrication of dukkha, the fabrication of the self-sense or of some perception of issue or whatever. And then might get interested in seeing, having seen that things are fabricated through the way of relating, through the way of looking, might get interested in these two related concepts, fabrication and ways of looking, and might decide to keep open that question. Well, I can see this is fabricated, for instance, like Papancha. What else is fabricated, or what is not fabricated? And might just pursue that question with the tool of ways of looking and developing the skills and arts involved in different ways of looking, with different degrees, depth, subtleties, and kinds of clinging involved, and pursue this double question of fabrication and ways of looking in practice. In practice, not just as some kind of abstract intellectual idea. A practitioner might get hold of this and kind of run with it in practice, and that's what I've referred to elsewhere as what I call the phenomenological approach. In other words, meeting one's experience and just bringing these concepts to bear, fabrication and ways of looking, and seeing what we can learn about experience, about fabrication of experience and ways of looking through exploring them, through playing and experimenting with that. And again, elsewhere in quite a lot of detail, and just briefly somewhere in the last couple of parts of this talk, we said that if a person does that, if a practitioner does that in practice, explores fabrication and ways of looking, this question, this probing of fabrication with ways of looking, then a possible trajectory will kind of almost inevitably arise out of that. A trajectory of, we could say, developing insights that we could conceive of as forming a kind of central strand for a notion of awakening, or one of the notions of awakening I'm sort of, or part of the notion of awakening I'm sort of offering as a possibility. Part of the notion, a direction that unfolds, and we said, and so there'll be this deepening, if you like, developing of insight, so including the insight into the fabrication of the personality and the perspective of not identifying with one's personality at times. And then we ran through a brief list. So, for example, one would experience and understand the perspective that the self is just a process of the psychophysical aggregates. And one would move beyond that in time, eventually, with the ripening of things, into views of experiences and views of universal oneness, and the self being part of that oneness, and all things being part of different onenesses at different levels, if you like, of love, of awareness, of nothingness, of all kinds of things. And pursuing this kind of non-fabricating direction even more, one will eventually open to the unfabricated, the deathless, and understand with that the thorough and complete and radical emptiness of all dharmas, all phenomena without exception. And then realizing, based on that any and all self-views should not be clung to, cannot really be clung to as any kind of final position, at least, because one knows the emptiness of all phenomena, all the elements that might possibly make up or be a foundation for any self. And then eventually one sees that fabrication itself is empty, as I said, and that kind of relativizes, if you like, the whole sense of the unfabricated, so that there's a non-duality and a non-elevation of the unfabricated over the fabricated, the beyond over this world, so to speak, and the holiness is then everywhere. And pursuing it even more, one begins to open up to the realization that all conceptual frameworks, conceptions and conceptual frameworks are, in a sense, empty, and that they're not finally true. They don't reflect or summarize or articulate a final truth, an ultimate viewpoint on how a thing is, how the things are, etc. And through that, actually, an even deeper sense of participation in the cosmos, participation in perception, participation also in truth, and even in the notion of what awakening is. So we kind of roughly outlined all that. And we also said that in that kind of possible trajectory perhaps makes, is a pretty good solution, or one pretty good solution to the kind of pieces of the jigsaw that we find in the Pali Canon, fitting Buddha saying this and the Buddha saying that, and how does it all fit together? Together with some Mahayana, some elaborations of what the Buddha said that are found in Mahayana texts, that go back to the Pali Canon, but that the Buddha didn't really pick up on and elaborate there. So, for instance, in the Kaccayana Sutta and stuff like that. Now, I said that, and I've kind of outlined it again. It may or may not be attractive to you. Is it? I don't know. When you hear that, I try to say it quite neutrally, but is that attractive? That sort of journey, that sort of unfolding, all that's involved in that? And again, this question, well, why, if it's not attractive? Why? What's going on for you? And if it is attractive, what's going on for you? And again, what is it that you want? What do you want? So all those questions I threw out in the first part of this talk are very much connected. They interweave all the way through this question, what is awakening, and this discussion of awakening. Now, actually, trajectory is the word I've been using. Is not quite the right word there, because it implies, or it seems to imply, a kind of linearity, a movement from here to there along a certain line. And my experience as a teacher is things are not always linear, even with that group of insights that I just kind of enumerated there very briefly. The movement of realization, the movement of the opening up of experience and understanding there is not always linear. Yes, the sort of latter end of that list that I just ran through, we could say that those are deeper insights. They're, generally speaking, harder to understand, to open to realize, to experience. They're more comprehensive. They take in more. They're more inclusive. So, for example, the experience of the unfabricated in a way that's dualistic with the fabricated, and not yet move to a level of non-duality, doesn't take in the holiness of the fabricated, doesn't include that. So the latter end of that list, as I said, is more inclusive, more comprehensive, more fundamental in some kind of sense. Yet, my experience, both for myself and working as a teacher, is that the intuition, the intuitive wisdom can make all kinds of leaps that at any point in practice, or in one's life of practice, that kind of make a bit of a mockery out of any linear map there. So that trajectory isn't quite the right word. Now, add in, if you like, or at some point, whether it's right near the beginning of someone's practice, along this trajectory of exploring fabrication and ways of looking, or whether they've gone through that whole trajectory and then they start hearing about soul-making and the erotic imaginal, but add in at some point, or weave in, perhaps better, weave in to that trajectory or set of insights that I described there, weave in, add in the whole paradigm and whole exploration of what we're calling the soul-making paradigm, or the erotic imaginal, exploration of the erotic imaginal, and which in itself is not linear at all. There's no real linearity. Well, perhaps there's a little bit of linearity, but generally speaking, it moves in a lot of possible different directions there. And it's not really so much of a linear movement as I've alluded to earlier. But start to weave that in with the other trajectory regarding fabrication and ways of looking and emptiness and all that. And the whole thing becomes really not so linear, so that trajectory is not necessarily, or at least universally common trajectory doesn't perhaps really, is not really adequate as a label. But this question, what you want, I don't know, with the soul-making side of things and the erotic imaginal side of things, perhaps that what you want, or the desire operating, must be authentic, because the eros and the desire is integral to the movement of soul-making. It's indispensable, it's fundamentally wrapped up in the movement of soul-making, in the erotic imaginal. No eros or desire, very little eros and desire means very little soul-making. So the question of what do you really want, the authenticity there is oftentimes in the soul, when we can speak kind of more purely of soul-making, it's kind of inevitable there. Remember too, just as a sort of footnote here, remember too that the paradigm of soul-making includes eros with images, or in relation to images, and also eros without images. Without the imaginal. I've elaborated this in, I think it was the Eros Unfettered talks. But so, Eros without the imaginal, or without images, means that Eros for the unfabricated, or for the realization and the opening to those realms that are less fabricated, that have less to do with image and perception in general, in that whole spectrum. But eventually that movement, that eros for the unfabricated, or eros in the direction of unfabricating along all that spectrum of onenesses, etc., jhanas and all that, eventually, with its maturity, as we mentioned, there's the realization of the emptiness of all things, and the non-duality there between what is fabricated and what isn't, and different degrees of fabrication. And then this opens up the legitimization, the kind of possibility to fabricate skillfully and fabricate in a way that includes images. So even the eros, there is eros that doesn't include images, but if I go deeply enough into that, it kind of delivers me a legitimization and a platform from which to explore fabrication with images, and then the eros with that. And then there's also eros with images, the erotic imaginal, and that directly involves itself in the participation of fabricating images, and participates in the fabrication of images with the erotic imaginal, with eros that is in relation to images. But when we include the soul-making, when we include the erotic imaginal, I should say, when we include sensing with soul, this will open up the whole sense of awakening and the whole sense of the path much wider than that trajectory that I outlined in the last couple of parts of the talk, briefly at the beginning. Sensing with soul opens out the whole sense of what awakening is and can be, and the whole sense of the path opens much wider. And in so doing, it, if you like, in this opening, it will push on the influences of however we have conceived of or imagined the tradition, and what the tradition says about awakening, or what we have conceived of or imagined the tradition says about awakening. It will push on this soul-making movement, this expansion of the soul-making dynamic will push on the unquestioned images that we have of awakening. The fixated images, the rigid images, the sensing with soul, the erotic imaginal, that aspect of the soul-making dynamic will really push on that. So some of the way this happens is, what should we say? It happens in small ways and in large ways. So, for example, we might have, and it would be very understandable, I think a lot of people do have, a kind of fixated fantasy or idea. By fixated fantasy I mean not one that's rich in soulfulness and eros and it's got that kind of rigidity to it and clinging to it and realism. But fixated fantasy or image or idea regarding awakening, that it kind of happens in a sudden moment. So one of the places we get that is from the myth of the Buddha, who sat up all night, made a strong vow, sat up all night in meditation, and just as the morning star was appearing, that was the moment. And everything permanently changed. In that moment, at that moment, done is what had to be done. Done was what had to be done. And there was, in this assumption, this idea, and this image, happens very suddenly, all done, everything is permanently changed, and there is also the freedom and the liberation that ensue, that open up, are pervasive. They're total, and they reach to every part of the practitioner's life. Now, that makes a good story, doesn't it? The suddenness of it, and the kind of black and whiteness of it. It's sudden, it's very dramatic. But if you, again, I'd just like to question that. Is it a true fact, or is it a kind of myth in the poor sense of the word? Oftentimes, there are many people you can meet who will share similar accounts, not necessarily with that degree of effort involved, and oftentimes they emphasize the exact absence of effort. But for myself, and you'll have to find out for yourself, but sometimes I meet these people, listen or read to their accounts, and listen to them or read their accounts, look at, hang out with, hear about the resultant awakenings, and sometimes it's really not that impressive. Oftentimes it's not that impressive what happens when there's that kind of story of sudden and then assumed pervasive liberation and deep, etc. The awakening often doesn't seem that deep. It's not also that pervasive. The insights are not so deep, nor are they pervasive, and nor the freedom. So there's kind of, I would call that a small way. It's a small point. But there are bigger and I think more important ways in which the opening up to the sensing with soul, the imaginal perception, will push on the whole notion and the whole image and fantasy of awakening, and what's involved in it. So this is very interesting to me. But I have observed that certain areas or kinds of freedom, if you like, areas or kinds of freedom of liberation may open at different times for a practitioner, and not by, for example, realization of unfabricated or emptiness, or the so-called eradication of greed, aversion, and delusion. Certain areas, certain kinds, are not going to be opened by those traditional means, or those traditional ideas. So, for example, can we even talk about sexual freedom? What is that? What is that? What does that mean? What even happens? What do you notice inside when you just hear that? What does it mean? What is that? So I want to say very clearly right now that I do not mean by the notion of sexual freedom, I do not mean acting in any way that is not respectful of another human being, or in any way that is unkind. So that's not sexual freedom. That's whatever that might mean. Sexual freedom or freeing might be a better way of putting it. It doesn't mean that. Lack of kindness, lack of respect in sexual relations, lack of attunement. Grossly misattuned to what's going on there, what the other person wants or needs, or what you want or need. So for both oneself and whoever one is being sexual with, there needs to be kindness, respect, attunement, and it needs to be consensual. These are just like, there's no question about this. Whatever sexual freedom or freeing means, it doesn't go against that. It doesn't cross those lines. And whatever you hear me say, or have heard me say, or perhaps another teacher around exploring eros and sexual images and sexual eros and all that, it never contravenes that in practice. And also sexual freedom, again, whatever it might mean, to me it doesn't mean that we necessarily have to open to what someone else or some subgroup considers more free or better, or what we are feeling pressured by some should or some fashion around sexuality or orientation or self-identification or whatever, or morality is like this, no, it's like this, or whatever. You decide if something's not okay for you. You decide if if it's okay and if it's interested. Not pushed around by subcultures and the kind of rhetoric that can happen there. So that's just an aside, but I consider it so important, just in case there's even the slightest misunderstanding in what we're saying here. But the main point here that I was trying to convey is yes, certain areas and kinds of freedom may not be opened up through realizing the unfabricated, realizing emptiness, eradicating greed, aversion, delusion. What's that going to do in regard to my sexual freedom? Again, whatever that means. I mean, do you really think, is there any evidence, does it seem that the spiritual teachers who claim awakening, that their liberation really extends fully to their sexuality? Fully? I mean, they might just choose celibacy and keep to that. That's not quite the same thing as sexual freedom, in the sense of the more open possibility of what that might mean. Or, not just sexuality, what about the area of intellect and ideas? You think that's going to open just because one has realized the unfabricated, or the eradication, so-called, of greed, aversion, delusion? What does it mean to be free? What is a freeing in relationship to the intellect and ideas? What is a freeing in relationship to creative expression? What is the liberation of personae as masks of God? So, what kinds and what areas and directions of liberation, of opening, of freeing are possible to us, and how do they arise? And if I'm locked into too narrow a view of what liberation delivers, and also what is the path to what liberation, I expect this kind of path to bring that kind of liberation. Is that realistic? But it may be, though, that imaginal practice and practice with particular images leads to all kinds of very specific liberations with regard to whatever that image or imaginal figure kind of what they embody in a certain area. Sometimes you meet people and they're practicing, fairly diligently and kind of steadily over some years, and maybe have done, some therapy, and found that useful, and it's an important part of their process, and they're practicing, trying to deepen their emptiness and their inquiry into fabrication, etc. But there's areas that none of that has reached, not the psychotherapy, in the kind of whatever traditional forms and attitudes, and not the emptiness practice. This person, very sort of balanced, sane person, the courage to stand up publicly and stand behind one's deepest convictions and passions has not been liberated. The courage to do so even at the risk of upsetting someone, of being kind of disadvantaged perhaps in terms of one's career, or maybe people won't see me as a nice guy, or I'll piss someone off, or I won't be a good boy, or whatever it is. More than the emptiness, more than even many kinds of therapy, more than all that, it might be that working imaginally, in the full way that we've been talked about it, images that involve such courage, such expressions, etc., that are really not being opened up through years of this kind of steady practice in certain directions. It may be that images involving those kinds of things, and they have to be arrived at in all the ways we talked about, and emerge in all the ways we talked about. But it may be that might open up areas and directions of freedom, prisons that don't even really feel like a prison. One's not even really realizing the lack of liberation there. But the imaginal practice may open up those in where the other practices won't. So it's easy to find, a spiritual or certainly a Buddhist basis to simply ignore those areas that I alluded to and those kinds of freedoms. Not to be free in those areas with ideas, with sexuality, with creative expression, with the liberation of personae, but to be free rather from sexuality, from desire, from, let's say, active engagement, from intellectual questioning and expansion. Because we can always find a teaching that says sexuality is just greed. Activism is not equanimous and peaceful. It's not undisturbed. It doesn't fit the image, the archetype. I've been into this in different talks previously. And intellectuality, we can always find a kind of rationale that says intellectuality is just conceptualizing. That's just conceptualizing, and we want non-conceptuality, or we want something called just being, or being simple, or whatever it is. So there's the possibility through the erotic imaginal of opening up wider areas and different kinds of liberation, awakening, freedom, and awakening and liberating different, whole other array or greater range of images and archetypes. Of breaking the lock of certain fixated images or a narrow range of archetypes that we might be operating unwittingly under. So that's part of what's involved in this larger and I think richer and more multi-dimensional kind of possibility of path and vision of awakening. The very images of awakening and the areas of awakening can be opened up. Now, again, we've been into it in a lot of detail in other retreats, but we said when the soul-making process gets going, the soul-making dynamic, it involves the mutual feeding, inseminating, widening, deepening, complicating, enriching, stretching of eros, psyche, and logos. They feed in to each other and kind of create and discover more of each other. The whole thing expands. We've explained that many times over the last few years. Eros, psyche, the soul-making dynamic is liberated. In other words, rather than being stuck in one particular circumference or range or way of relating, the soul-making dynamic, the eros, psyche, logos dynamic is liberated. Eros, psyche, and logos are liberated to some extent in that soul-making dynamic. That's kind of another way of saying what's going on in soul-making. Eros, psyche, and logos, and as well as images getting pushed on, as we talked about just now, the logos, ideas, will also get pushed on, and more than just get pushed on, ideas. Logos, as one of the elements of soul-making, is exactly that. It's an element of soul-making. It's involved, it's worked, it's stretched, it's relied on. So that part of the soul, what a vision of soul-making, awakening and path, must involve logos, must involve concept, must involve idea as something creative, fertile, active, experimental, so that the exploration of and the experimenting with ideas and with conceptual frameworks, different ideas, different conceptual frameworks, exploring them, experimenting them with them in practice, so that they inform ways of looking and thus open up different perceptions and experiences, and that feeds the whole process. But that whole involvement and inclusion of ideas deliberately and conceptual exploration, conceptual flexibility is, in our definition, part of the very soul-making dynamic, part of what is liberated, and part of what moves in the direction of awakening. So we borrow, discover, create ideas and conceptual frameworks, and then in the soul-making that happens in practice, those ideas get stretched or they break, and then we forge, discover, borrow, create new ideas, perhaps built on those old ones, perhaps different, whatever, ideas and conceptual frameworks. And all of that, and that whole process is included in awakening. And awakening, notice, is a verb form. Well, it can be used as a verbal noun, but it's actually also a present participle. Awakening. It's something that is happening, ongoing. Awakening. This open-endedness that I referred to. So sometimes, for different reasons, and I've talked about this before, there's a real kind of shunning of the conceptual, not really an inclusion or an embracing or a willingness to play with and experiment with ideas and conceptual frameworks. And that comes from a lot of different that hesitation or a suspicion or refusal comes from a lot of different directions. Some of it, based on kind of teachings of non-conceptuality, as we mentioned just a few moments ago, as being kind of more spiritual, the direction of spirituality or whatever. Other hesitations come more from modernist Western philosophy, which is really suspicious of any kind of metaphysical systems, metaphysics in general, or conceptual frameworks in particular. Even just building an edifice of concepts or a system or whatever. Quite popular in the last, I don't know, let's say 100 years. Is this suspicion of systems and conceptual frameworks, and it goes with postmodernism, I think, at its less well considered sort of depth. Because people think that if you have a conceptual frame, if you have a system, you must be claiming that as an ultimate truth. You must be claiming that as a kind of all-encompassing final take on what reality is. And that's not the way we're using that. That's not the way that this soul-making dynamic engages. It's not the relationship it has with concepts, conceptual frameworks, and ideas. So a philosopher called Richard Bernstein was writing, and he talked about several other philosophers, and one guy called Jürgen Habermas, 20th century philosopher. I think he's still alive. And he's talking about some other guys called like Heidegger and Adorno and Derrida, and pointing at these guys and saying all these people defend themselves as if they were living in the shadow of the last philosopher. They are still, this is Habermas talking about Derrida and Heidegger and Adorno, they are still who are kind of quite, well, adopted by postmodern thinkers, let's put it that way. Habermas continues, they are still battling against the strong concepts of theory, truth and system, by which he means what I just said, as if this is the truth. So to say X or Y, this is my theory, or this is the conceptual framework, or this is the system, a strong concept of that means that one pushes it forward as all-encompassing, ultimate reflection of reality. They are still battling against the strong concepts of theory, truth, and system that have actually belonged to the past for over a century and a half. They believe that they have to tear philosophy away from the madness of expounding a theory that has the last word. And this guy Bernstein continues, their failure, according to Habermas, is not to realize and fully appreciate that the fallibilist consciousness of the sciences caught up with philosophy too a long time ago. Meaning, what he means by the fallibilist consciousness, fallibilist means to fallible, to make a mistake. So, according to Habermas, you realize science has this idea that you sort of tentatively put forward a theory, and if it matches the experimental results, great, but you never claim it as a final truth in that philosophy of science, and you realize that it's fallible. You can always, someone might do an experiment, or some experimental result might show up at any point, and that proves your theory is not quite right. So that's the fallibilist consciousness of the sciences, and according to Habermas, that caught up with philosophy a long time ago. So what you get in some strands of philosophy is this idea of all they want to do is tear things down, tear down systems, tear down ideas, tear down truth claims, tear down theories, tear down conceptual frameworks, deconstruct. And Bernstein is making the point, and this is where I would have made the point and would really agree. Deconstruction, he writes, is not sufficient. It must be complemented by reconstruction. I'll come back to that in a second. Just a word more about this business of fallibilist consciousness of the sciences. That reflects another philosopher called Karl Popper, that was his theory of philosophy of science, is that it sort of tentatively puts forward a theory which approaches the truth. Theories approach the truth incrementally, and they get proved wrong, and then another theory replaces that. But you're approaching something called the truth. And Habermas, so it's quite a realist philosophy. It says something, well, we may not know whether this theory that we have now is completely true, because it can always be proven wrong by some as yet undiscovered experimental result. But there is something called truth, and we can approach it. And so there's a kind of realism there, and Habermas is kind of a realist. And that's a different idea, a different notion that's more than, say, a participatory notion of truth. More based on the deep notion of emptiness and ways of looking, as I talked about. That's just a side point. But let's come back to this business about deconstruction is not sufficient. Any deconstruction we do must be eventually followed by reconstructions. So that's what's happening, both in the trajectory of emptiness exploration, exploration of fabrication and ways of looking that I outlined. One deconstructs less and less fabrication. One learns how to do that. And eventually, having reached the unfabricated, then seeing the emptiness of fabrication, because time is empty and what is fabricated is empty, and the elements of fabrication is empty. Then that opens up this non-duality, as I mentioned, between the unfabricated and the fabricated, and it legitimizes and sacralizes fabrication itself. There's no duality. The unfabricated is not better than the fabricated in any way. It's not more holy, etc. It's not even more real. And so that legitimizes, opens the gate to the possibility of skillful fabrication, and part of that can be soul-making fabrication. So on the trajectory of the deepening exploration of emptiness, fabrication, ways of looking, and also in the practices of sensing with soul, which include the kind of, as I said, flexible, temporary adoption, entertainment, trying out, playing with, experimenting with, constructing, and then brushing aside, or adopting some of conceptual frameworks, then brushing them aside, adopting another one. Deconstructing them, reconstructing something different, logoi, ideas, conceptual frameworks. So both in the kind of emptiness trajectory and in the sensing with soul practices, there's this indispensable element that involves deconstruction and reconstruction many times, and endlessly variable. The possibility of endless variations there. Sometimes what happens, I just linger with this business about conceptuality, because I think it's so important, and so subtle, in fact, as well. So sometimes, occasionally, what happens, I've encountered a student occasionally who is practicing with emptiness, and practicing quite creatively with emptiness and deeply, and sees, glimpses the non-truth of all concepts, as I said earlier, in different ways. But then after that, picks up on teachers, for instance, ancient or translations of ancient Zen teachers from centuries ago, who seem to be saying, drop concepts, or just sit quietly and do nothing, or just be simple, or that kind of thing. And this person who has actually glimpsed the non-truth of concepts through practicing with fabrication and ways of looking and really contemplating conceptuality and perceptuality, doesn't realize that it then tries to adopt this kind of, or believes that it issues this kind of realization of the non-truth of all concepts, realizes in this issues in this teaching of drop concepts, just be simple, just sit quietly, and doesn't realize that is a concept. It's not just a concept, it's also a psychological style. It's one style of soul, one kind of archetype. It's the archetype of the simple man, if you like, or the natural man, or whatever. So to settle or fall back into that without realizing that conceptuality is actually operating and supporting such a stance, and without recognizing the pull of, that there's a pull there of an archetypal image or a fantasy, that's not liberation. There's not a liberation. One's still caught. One's seen something deeply. One's still caught, A, in subtle conceptuality that's operating there, and B, in a kind of predilection or unilarity, whatever the word is, singularity of a certain archetypal image. So it's like walking into a prison cell, and just because it's got, perhaps centuries ago, an old, now long dead inmate hung a sign over the door a long time ago, and it says liberation, nirvana, and freedom. And you walk into that cell and sit there, shut the door, and just because of the sign, one believes it. And actually, one's in a prison, both in terms of soul, because of the limited archetype, but also in terms of not realizing the subtle conceptuality that's involved. So when we talk about the kind of the sense of what awakening might be in a soul-making paradigm, it includes, as I said, this deconstruction, reconstruction, involvement, experimentation, fracturing, breaking open, stretching, forging ideas and conceptual frameworks. And so there isn't this stasis to it, and it doesn't get stuck with a certain conceptual range or conceptual idea. Or if it does, that's only temporary, because the soul making will keep at some point pushing and breaking whatever vessels. Pushing on and breaking whatever vessels. So do you remember, and I can't now remember which talk it was in the series, but I quoted Carl Jung, and he was talking about the scientific revolution around the time of the Renaissance and the Western Enlightenment. And he pointed out, it was this newly won rational intellectual stability of the human mind that came with the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. It managed to hold on against the kind of older ways of thinking of the Middle Ages and medieval thought. And it managed to hold on and penetrate further into the depths of nature, further even than earlier ages had even considered possible. And then he writes, if you remember, the more successful the penetration and advance of the new scientific spirit proved to be, the more successful the penetration and advance of the new scientific spirit proved to be, the more the latter, the more that scientific spirit, as is usually the case with the victor, became the prisoner of the world it had conquered. In other words, that whole brilliant opening that happened in around the time of the scientific revolution and the Western Enlightenment in Europe, that whole brilliant opening, the conceptual framework that crystallized with that, over time, over some hundreds of years, developed and also became a prison, became hardened. and as Jung put it, the victor. That conceptual framework it won out over the medieval ways of thinking. It was a victor, but then it became the prisoner of the world it conquered. It became the prisoner of its own system. And the soul-making kind of paradigm of awakening would, in a way, if it's working, soul-making would not allow that. Inevitably, in the vortex and the movement and the expansion, the widening and deepening of the eros psyche logos dynamic, which is what soul-making involves, that cannot happen. As I said, we will break out of any conceptual framework, break out of any kind of rigidified structure of conceptuality and also image. So very easily for us, awakening, liberation, nirvana, enlightenment, whatever, can become what Henri Corbin calls an idol, in distinction to an icon. An idol is something that is taken to be real and has a kind of limit to it. I'm trying to explain what I mean. Sometimes a couple of people in the past have said, "You're such an iconoclast, Rob." I'm not sure that I am, but I think what I'm interested in here is more smashing idols, or kind of exposing what we might call idols and idolatry, and along with that kind of deconstruction, creating icons. So the difference between icon and idol, I'm borrowing this distinction from Henri Corbin, I'm pretty sure, and also from another French theologian, philosopher called Jean-Luc Marion. So the icon possesses infinite depth because it's imaginal. So it might be a form there, but remember the elastic soft edges being one aspect of the imaginal? The imaginal form might be really vivid as a sensible form, as an aesthetic form, really vivid and sharply defined, but the being of it has soft and elastic edges, and it has this capacity through the soul-making, through the erotic relationship with it, it will be perceived with more and more depth, more and more dimensionality will be perceived as part of it, as an aspect of it. It will open up a sense of itself having more dimensionality, more depth, more possibility, more divinity. Soul-making is possible in relation to an icon, but when soul-making gets hold of an idol, something rigidly, solidly defined and believed in as real, with tight, rigid boundaries, not soft, not elastic, then the soul-making will make those boundaries of an idol elastic and soft, or smash it and expand it, or replace it, or whatever, till we have an icon. Soul-making needs icon, not idol. And there won't be an end to that. So an icon is something with this kind of potentially endless possibility of dimensionality and divinity and depth, soul-making potential. So, in questioning kind of typical ideas of awakening that have actually become what we could call in that language idols, solid, unmoving, rigidly and tightly boundaried, fixed and limited forms and depths. In questioning in that way, and opening up instead new possible visions or ideas of awakening, where awakening is not limited either by an end point or in terms of direction. That whole process converts idol into icon. Soul-making has gotten hold of the notion of awakening and discovers its own meanings of what awakening is and involves. It stretches whatever original concept, image, idol we might have started with. Then, so with an icon, as I said, it's not limited, its being isn't limited in that way because of these soft elastic edges. We will eros in relation, soul in relation to an icon discovers, creates more and more dimensions and depths. And in that way, eros doesn't collapse then. It doesn't run out of space, of beyond, to long for, to move into, to create, discover. It has eros in relationship to awakening doesn't collapse, because it has an infinity of possibility in which to move. Infinity of possibility for the expansion of psyche and logos. You understand? So the title of the talk is What is Awakening? What is awakening? And we could hear that in what is awakening? What is awakening? As in what awakens or who awakens? If we answer it's what awakens? What is awakening? Who awakens? If we answer it's soul-making that awakens. That is what is awakening. That is, if you like, the subject of awakening. That is who is awakening. It's the soul and soul-making. Then that implies, in our very definition, that there's this infinite possibilities that come with the soul-making dynamic, with the involvement, fertilization, insemination, widening, deepening, expansion, all that of the eros, psyche, logos, of eros, psyche and logos. And that means, that implies this open-endedness, same thing. Important note in relation to that, when we say infinite, there can be an infinity of possibilities, an infinity of potential, and even infinity of actualizations, but infinite doesn't mean all possibilities or every possibility. So this doesn't mean that awakening means everything, means every possibility gets actualized, or is even a potential direction. So, for example, if you imagine, if that's a hard concept, imagine, let's say a circle which is like the face of a clock or a watch, and you could say these directions, the 12 o'clock, the 3 o'clock, the 6 o'clock, and the 9 o'clock directions on the face of the clock, they are not directions that soul-making awakening will pursue. It just won't pursue those directions. That won't happen in the possibility of soul-making. That still leaves an infinity of other directions just on that circle, because you can divide up the areas that remain, say between the 12 o'clock and the 3 o'clock, or the 3 and the 6, and the 6, the 9, the 9, the 12. You can divide up those areas infinitely. Yeah, so infinite possibilities of direction doesn't mean all and every direction will be viable or is open as a direction of soul-making. sometimes when this question is put, what is awakening? And one can hear that in two ways. So as just kind of alluded to, what is awakening? Question mark. The question can be heard with in two ways. What is awakening? Like, what does that concept mean? And we've talked about that a lot and the possibilities there. But as I said, it can be heard in a second way. What is awakening? Or what awakens? Or who awakens? Who is awakening? Now, regarding the question when it's heard that way, one could give, or there are certain answers to the question that way that are quite popular in kind of, I don't know, Neo-Advaita circles or whatever. And the answer given is, who awakens or what awakens? No one. The answer is no one awakens, or awakening is awakening, or the universe is awakening. So answering that question, what is awakening or what awakens, answering it in that kind of way helps take some of the restriction, imprisonment, weight or burden out of a desire for awakening when it's coming out of ego, when it's for the sake of ego or self-measurement or in reaction to the inner critic. Or it's this desire for awakening is trying to prove myself or to the inner critic or to my parent or parents or my teacher or teachers or to the world. We touched on this. So this notion is no one awakens. It does have a certain unburdening effect, so it can be useful. But there's something about such an answer that in insisting on a kind of non-definition or nebulous, vague kind of openness, that kind of answer, those kind of attitudes or conceptions, and there is a conception involved there, or conceptions involved, those kind of stances, they might be forming their own strange kinds of prison. In that very non-definition or vagueness. There's not, why? Because there's not much fertility or movement possible within that view. There's something about the vagueness that doesn't allow me to actually posit and work with different concepts within that, or answers to that question, and work with different conceptual delineations, etc. Perspectives, concepts, ideas. So, if you contrast this, what awakens? Who awakens? No one. No one awakens. If you contrast that with, for example, the conceptual framework we're trying to encourage, that is a conceptual framework that itself allows, encourages, and actually expects soul in the process to notice, to discover and create ever more delineations, concepts, and perspectives. Create and discover all that in time. Regarding what awakening is and regarding who or what is awakening. Do you understand the difference? In this paradigm, none of those delineations, concepts, perspectives regarding what awakening is or who or what is awakening, who or what awakens, none of them are clung to as truths or reflections of reality. But nevertheless they can be entertained and lived and practiced with, and they can bring therefore all kinds of fruits and results and openings, none of them being regarded as final. So like we said when we talked about what is soul, if I say sensing with soul, okay, well that begs the question, what is soul? Remember that? And we said we can say something about what soul is, but we want it to have the concept of soul to have these soft, elastic edges. It's not a rigidly fixed and limited concept. So it can stretch. What awakens? Soul awakens, soul-making awakens. What does that mean? So there's not the shunning of concepts. No one awakens. There's the using of concepts to, and then those concepts get enlarged, broken, new concepts get forged. So sometimes the answers that we give to these questions, what is awakening, what awakens, who awakens, they help in certain ways, but they also limit the possible fertility for the being, for the consciousness, for the sense of existence, for the soul. They don't stimulate and support the creation and discovery of further delineations, further discernments, more and more aspects, facets of self, soul, being, others, objects, world, awakening. So again, we are in this soul-making paradigm, we're really not shunning or disregarding discriminations, discernments, delineations, and concepts. We're using them for the sake of soul-making, and the soul-making process will actually stimulate more of that as part of its kind of endless possibility of riches. So, again, this question, what do you want? What do you want? And is that what soul wants? Or is what comes through and seems to be my desire, is it driven by something else? As we said, ego or measuring up, or is it that what I want is culturally influenced or indoctrinated, or I've taken a certain idea or fixated image of what the tradition is, or I've believed the tradition is this? Or is it that what I want and the I there is actually quite a limited self-image? I'm not imaginally open. The self is not imaginally sensed in the what I want. What is the relationship of who desires or has eros for awakening? What is the relationship of who desires awakening to who awakens? Again, what is the relationship of who desires awakening to who awakens? And you may have heard answers to that kind of question, for instance, in certain so-called non-dual teachings, or according to sort of classical Buddhist Abhidharmic psychology, or whatever. What would a soul-making answer say to that? What is the relationship of that which desires awakening, or the one who desires awakening, the relationship of that to the one who awakens, the relationship of the desirer of awakening to the awakened? What awakens is what has wanted awakening. What awakens is what has the eros for awakening. So fantasies, images, and ideas come in, all kinds of fantasies, images, and ideas come in and influence the fantasies, images, ideas we have of awakening. Some of those fantasies, images, and ideas can be what we call fixations, or not, or more or less so. And some of them are fantasies and images and ideas of self and also of the world. So the fantasies, images, and ideas of self and of the world condition the fantasies, images, ideas we adopt of awakening. So, I don't know if this has occurred to you, but do you realize that when I choose or accept a notion or a vision of awakening or enlightenment or whatever, that you are, or I am, in doing so, kind of signing up for or plumping for or choosing a worldview, a cosmology. It's not just a view of awakening. In choosing a view of awakening and adopting a certain view of awakening, I'm also choosing and adopting a certain cosmology too. At the same time, they go inevitably together. And it may be, so for example, if I have the cosmology of endless rebirth, and then the vision of awakening as ending rebirth, goes with a cosmology of rebirth. And the vision of awakening as somehow bearing up to, putting up with our existential predicament as sort of tragically impermanent and frail in a kind of essentially meaningless cosmos. The image of the liberated one, the awakened one, as one who actually just is willing to confront that and be with the tragedy of that, open to it, and still lives their life creatively, etc. The image of awakening, the idea of awakening, brings with it, goes together with a certain cosmology. And in the soul-making paradox, it's exactly the same. The soul-making awakening vision that we're perhaps opening up, or possibilities that we're opening up, goes with a certain cosmology, which includes possibilities of cosmopoesis and participation and all that, and divinities and dimensions. And so when we choose or adopt an idea or an image of awakening, we're actually also choosing and adopting ideas of world, self and world. And the causality, who knows what's going on there? So again, the question is why? Is it really the cosmology that I'm attracted to? And I'm just set on that cosmology, and I insist on that cosmology. And it's working that way round, from the world view to the view of awakening. Or how much is self-view wrapped up in that? So the choice of cosmology may in fact be the primary reason for you or I choosing or accepting a certain notion or vision of awakening. You understand? That may be actually what I long for more, is a certain cosmology, a certain worldview. It's all wrapped up together. And the self-view or the ego view. And if it's with regarding measurement or proving myself or achieving or failing, that can come into it, like we've talked about before. Or it might be that there's a certain soul-making or self-image in relation to the worldview, cosmos, view, cosmology that's coming in here, that's being chosen. We're choosing a package. So, for example, bravely and honestly facing up to the tragic existential predicament is one self-image, and it may be soul-making for some people to a certain extent, or the self-image of what a human being is. Human being opens to all kinds of dimensions. Human beings participate in the cosmos, in the divine, in the creation and discovery of all this. It's a very different sense of self and image of self, an idea of self. But again, back to this, it's like, why this question, why am I choosing or adopting a certain idea or image of awakening? What's involved there? One of the things that's involved is cosmology and self-sense, or you could say anthropology. And I've pointed out, in this connection, I've pointed out several times before that the contemporary, or dukkha in the contemporary times, may well involve, there may be kinds of dukkha that are prominent in what we deal with or have to face that weren't there at other times. So, for example, our modernist notion of self brings with it, as much as a lot of possibility, it brings with it a certain kind of dukkha. So I'm not talking about, by modern self, I'm not talking about how busy we all are and how we're harangued by mobile phones and emails and text messages and all that. And, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just the modern notion of individuality and the culture of individuality and the pressures and expectations that brings alongside the possibilities. And I'm talking also about our very sense of our own psychological complexity and interiority, and also responsibility. So Michel Foucault, one of the things he did was trace, in regard to sexuality, how through the tradition of the Catholic confessional, and then later through the very similar and connected tradition of the psychoanalytic confessional, which became the psychotherapeutic confessional, that actually there was a broadening, a stretching of what the individual was then deemed responsible for. So at first, with regard to sexuality in the Catholic confession, it was just around the ethics of that, and the more you're responsible for good or bad behavior sexually and thoughts and all that. But through that, and through the kind of pressure of that, and the kind of minutiae of that got expanded in that process, and then through psychoanalysis, and then through the kind of sexual revolution, and then the responsibility of sexuality was not just ethical, because now we're supposed to, there's a kind of responsibility to be interesting sexually, or like this, or like that, around our sexuality. Sexuality has become, not for everyone, but for a lot of people, in some ways part of identity, and it's part of my responsibility for my individuality, and what I kind of am, or have achieved, or am okay with, or have liberated, or whatever. Someone in the time of the Buddha's India, at the time of the Buddha in India, didn't have this kind of complexity, didn't have that culture of individuality, didn't have that kind of responsibility in regard to their sexuality, of being like interesting, or this or that, or individual in that sense. So there's certain dukkhas around self that are kind of, that go with contemporary cultures, contemporary society, and also certain dukkhas around the world. And again, I've mentioned this as well: the disenchantment of the cosmos, the meaningless of the cosmos. That is the kind of pervasive backdrop, if not foreground, of our worldview. And that, I don't know if this is, it's certainly characteristic of our modern culture in differentiation to earlier cultures in some ways, But if you also think about the whole notion of rebirth, that's in the Pali Canon, etc., it it's not a, in some ways it's an enchanted cosmos with devas and all that. In some other ways it's a scary cosmos. It's a again, essentially meaningless cosmos. It's a meaningless predicament that one has to find one's way out of. One is essentially just flotsam and jetsam on the ocean of cosmic, endlessly infinite ocean of cosmic rebirths and deaths, and just tossed this way and that by waves and tides and all that. And it's a kind of scary cosmic picture. Nevertheless, there are certain kinds of disenchantment and meaninglessness, I think, that plague and pervade contemporary society. And along with this, like kind of the problematic of the complexity and individuality of the modern self, that also serves up to us a more difficult or a different kind of dukkha in relation to self and in relation to cosmos. Now, as I mentioned the other day, we're conscious, or some people are beginning to be conscious of the moral and environmental implications of perceiving and conceiving the cosmos in a disenchanted way, in a flat way. Especially in the implications, the consequences in a globalized world. And there is a sense, for some people now, that we need a different view, we need a different worldview, we need a different world views offered to us, different picture, different concept of what existence is, both for the self and the self in the cosmos and what the cosmos is. So, in this possible idea of what awakening might be, in a way that includes to include the soul-making process and dynamic and movement, such a view, to me, will include more and more facets of our being, just because of the way the soul-making dynamic works, and I've talked about this a lot elsewhere. It will draw in, it will involve, it will start to relate to all these different aspects of our lives and dimensions and facets of our being. It will create and discover such facets of our existence, and make them objects of eros, objects, imaginal objects, and they get drawn into the whole soul-making process, and in so doing they get drawn in to the awakening process, the movement of awakening. They get included as directions and expansions and unfoldings of awakening. And so that's quite, and that process, it will just keep creating and discovering, not always just at some kind of uniform rate. There'll be stops and starts and stuck places, and of course, but potentially at least that's the movement. It's open-ended and multiple and multi-directional, and in that way. Where some ideas we get of awakening, or even what's communicated to us sometimes by people who claim awakening in some traditions or some communities, certainly that I've come across, the awakening can be more stagnant, really, than the kind of dynamic and endless and endlessly enriching and dividing and like branches growing of a kind of live organism, as I have tried to sort of describe. It can be a little more stagnant, the whole idea. So in some traditions and sanghas, and some traditions, some communities, it's is relatively common for people to consider themselves awakened. But as I say, often there's a kind of stagnation with that awakening. And we can look at that stagnation from the paradigm of the soul-making logos, and we can say either there is not enough eros. So for example, I'm awakened, and yeah, there's definitely a certain amount of happiness, certain amount of freedom and ease of movement, and liberation from the inner critic, certain amount of peace, even keeledness, etc. But it's just kind of stagnated there. I've been awakened for X years, and now what? Until one begins to teach or write a blog or hold darshan or whatever it is. But there's not, something's actually just stagnant. There's perhaps not enough eros there to open up further territories and possibilities for consciousness, for questioning, further liberations, explorations. So either not enough eros to stimulate and push that whole soul-making dynamic in a way that does open up further territories, or the logos is blocked or stuck in some conception, for example, that awakening means this. This is what awakening is, and I now seem to have achieved that. Or awakening means X, or awakening is this, or I am awakened. And here it's not so much the I that is the problem. Some, again, kind of non-dual people will be quick to say, that's the problem, it's I am awakened, that's the view, that's the problem view. There is no one, there is no I who awakens or is awakened, there is just awakening. But that's not the problem I want to pinpoint right now. The problem is in the reification and limitation of the vision and idea of awakening, of what it is and what it involves and where it goes. So either there's not enough eros, or the logos is blocked and stuck in a conception of awakening, in some particular narrow conception of awakening, despite the relative ease and happiness and kind of spacious existence. Or logos is stuck in the sense that we're stuck with a conception that conceiving is bad and a bad idea and not spiritual, and etc. But either way, whether it's the eros that's kind of there just isn't enough eros, there's no more fire. There's no more fire to the extent that, or flow of eros to the extent that really pushes things, that continues to push things, continues to expand. Or the logos is blocked in some way or other, perhaps with regard to awakening. But either way, the soul-making dynamic, the eros, psyche, logos dynamic is arrested, or at least limited. And because of that, no more or no further or no greater or wider awakening can open. Just share one more thing to finish. In the book of Genesis, some of you will know, God said to Abraham, this is a passage from Genesis, God said to Abraham, leave your country, your people and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. Leave your country, your people and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. Actually, I prefer that old-fashioned translation. Don't know if this is King James or something similar, but the Lord said unto Abraham, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto the land that I will show thee. So it's a very, for those of you who know the Old Testament, there's a very sort of crucial passage there. And the Hebrew is lech lecha, leave, go from here. Lech lecha, go from here. Actually, it can also mean go to you, lecha, go to you, or go for you. But let's just say go from here. We could hear that, go from here. Obviously you can hear all this in a very kind of historical, literal sense. But if we look, what's the perhaps the more poetic meaning here, the soul meaning? Lech lecha, go from here. Go from what? From bondage to liberation. Go from non-awakening to awakening. And again, certain teachings, perhaps certain kind of so-called non-dual teachings might say, you're always here, or you're always there, you're always in perfection. There's nowhere to go, nothing to do, nowhere to go. Awakening is just realizing that there's nowhere to go. And there in the Genesis it says, Lech lecha, go from here. Beautiful. I love that. I'm going to read it again. Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto the land that I will show thee. A soul-making logos might interpret that passage differently in a soul-making way. Go from what? Get thee out of thy country, away from here, away from thy kindred, away from thy father's house. Go from whatever is not soul-making anymore into new, expanding, deepening soul lands, to the land that I will show you. The landscapes that open up with soul. The land that I will show thee. Pastures, new fields of eros, psyche, logos for soul making. And this is always a possibility, this leaving the stagnation of structures that we know, of beliefs, the limited fixated images, the rigid concepts, beliefs, assumptions. It's always a possibility, since the possibilities for soul making are infinite. So wherever we are, there's the possibility of more at some point. And so is hearing that passage, God's commandment there in Genesis there, it's God's calling, the call to Abraham, God's call to us. So we can read it in this very historic, literal, kind of flattened way, and then it becomes all about territory and land and all this business and kind of literalized nationalism there coming out of that. Or you can hear it as something speaking to you, God's calling, and it's eternal, it's always now. Always now. Lech lecha, go from here. Be ready. Or if you say not eternal, perennial. Perennials may be a better word. Again and again, the soul-making dynamics, as I said, soul-making is not always on the move. It has times of consolidation, of getting used to new structures, new landscapes, new visions, new images, new sensings. But perennially, again and again, there's this movement, this expansion of the soul-making dynamic, and with that, the whole territory, the whole land that we perceive ourselves in. So again and again, forever, whenever, God calls, the divine calls, the Buddha nature, soul, issues a calling to soul. Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house. The father's house, the way tradition has rigidified. Unto the land that I will show thee. the land that soul opens up, the land that eros, psyche, logos open up as the soul-making dynamic calls. So just finish now. Some I said that sometimes people ask me, what my position is on what awakening is and what stream entry is and all that, and what do I think about X or Y in terms of some idea of awakening or whatever. And I've shared a good deal in this talk, but actually, and kind of follows from what I've said. My position, or what I think, is that I actually adopt and move between different conceptual frameworks, and that feels to me right now as the most beautiful and viable and, if you like, true way of orienting and relating to this whole question, this whole notion of awakening. And it is possible to do that, to pick up and put down and move between different conceptual frames, and do that relatively freely, or dependent on who I'm actually talking to and what they want or need at a certain time. We could say there's a kind of, or there's the possibility of a kind of, could say freedom from awakening, but I think better a freedom in relationship to the whole notion of awakening. Freedom in relationship to the whole notion of awakening. That's a freedom in relationship, not throwing it away. Freedom in relationship to the whole notion of awakening. Freedom in relationship to the whole notion of freedom. So one can actually know the emptiness of it all, and know and play with the poetry and the possibility of it all. The notion, idea, sense of awakening can be opened up.
Thank you for listening. To learn how you can support the teachers and Dharma Seed,